Wanted to welcome everybody. Thank you for coming out tonight on a really cold night. My name is Joyce Lee, and this event tonight is being held in conjunction with an exhibition that's on view right now at Chinatown Soup at 16B Orchard Street. So if you haven't had a chance to check it out, I would encourage you to do so. I'll just give you a brief description about the show, so for those of you that haven't seen it, you'll have a little bit of context of kind of where our conversation is grounded in tonight. So Firewall Internet Cafe is an art installation that is interactive and engages the public. It's a pop-up internet cafe where it looks and feels just like a regular internet cafe, but when you go in and sit down at one of the computer stations, you'll see two screens, and the computers simultaneously search Google in the US, and then is proxied to computers in China so that it also simultaneously searches Baidu in China. And my partner is Dan Pfeiffer, who you'll be hearing a little bit more from today, so he can explain kind of how that works and all the technical aspects of it. Essentially, we are using a proxy service from a new company called uProxy, which you'll hear about as well tonight. And the software is called Firewall. It's a browser plugin that automatically translates whatever you type in either English or Chinese to the opposite language, and then conducts an image search in the other country's search engine. And so the point of the project is to see kind of the differences that exist between the two countries on the internet. And so not only is a project exploring internet freedom issues, but also looking at things like cultural differences and different worldviews between the US and China. So I'm an artist. I'll admit up front that my background is not in this area of expertise that we're talking about tonight, which is creative hacktivism, but it's obviously very much part of my project. And so tonight I've invited some experts to join the conversation and share a little bit about the work that they do. So we'll kind of start off by focusing on some of the things that are often restricted on the internet, and we're gonna then transition the conversation to kind of talk about the techniques and the technical aspects of how that's done. Okay? So I'm just gonna sit down and introduce our panelists for tonight. Okay. And feel free at any point, if you guys have questions, to raise your hand, but we'll also have a Q&A at the end for people to ask more questions. All right, so to my right is Cece Wei. She is an investigative journalist, designer, and developer for ProPublica, where she builds interactive stories that serve the public interest. Her work has ranged from investigating which U.S. colleges saddle students with the most debt to monitoring how often China blocks international news outlets. Cece has won numerous awards, including the, I don't even know how to pronounce that, Malofy?
It's a terrible word to pronounce, but Malofiege.
Malofiege. She can tell us more about that. Yeah. SND Digital and ONA Awards, as well as a Gannett Award for Innovation in Watchdog Journalism. To Cece's right is Dan Pfeiffer. So he's my collaborator for Firewall Internet Cafe, and he is a program and artist based in Brooklyn, working on projects that use computer networks as a raw material. Dan collaborated to build the technology that runs Firewall Cafe, and he is a research fellow currently at Columbia's Tao Center for Digital Journalism, and he works at Mapson. Next to Dan, we have Jason Ng. Jason Ng is a research fellow at the University of Toronto's Citizen Lab and a data analyst at Tumblr. He is the author of the book Blocked on Weibo and a research consultant at China Digital Times. There he develops censorship monitoring. And he also teaches on digital activism at Columbia University. So here we go. I wanted to kind of start off the conversation with each of the panelists telling us a little bit about how did you all become initially interested in issues of internet freedom?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. Yeah, so hi everyone. So ProPublica, for those of you who might have not heard of us before, we're a nonprofit investigative journalism organization, and we're about 7 to 8 years old. And so the coverage area that overlaps with sort of internet freedom issues is sort of our digital security and surveillance beat. And so we have covered sort of specifically what we're going to talk about here tonight, but also the other arm of this is sort of covering, like, in the United States, the NSA and sort of surveillance here. And the projects that the team that I am on works on are all revolving around how do we use technology to tell stories. And so traditionally I don't write a lot of stories, but rather I build a lot of projects that sort of allow people to look up something that is relevant to them in some way. And for us, sort of really getting into this, the first project I think ProPublica ever did regarding censorship in China was actually very closely related to the book that Jason wrote, which is looking at sort of downloading and capturing what posts were actually being deleted off Weibo and sort of saving them and then showing them to the public and sort of translating them all into English, because our readership is mostly sort of like very well-educated Western readers. And so we wanted to be able to translate the actual messages, not automatically, but through translators, and have them sort of see the visuals and then understand what was blocked. And then the project specifically that I worked on relevant to this conversation was sort of looking at what international news outlets are blocked. And our aspirations originally were to look at it in multiple countries, including China. But then we ran into sort of like some security issues involving the technology and sort of not putting people in danger for hosting the technology that we would need to gather that information. And so then, so that's sort of like where we are now. But we also sort of cover, from a technology perspective, what can we discover about censorship and like whether or not U.S. companies are participating or not participating, because you sort of can't hide certain things through the technology. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And actually, I'd be curious to hear from the panelists too, kind of your personal story. Like, we want to hear about the work that you're doing tonight, but also just kind of what was that first moment that got you curious about doing this type of work?
All right. So I'm Dan Pfeiffer, and I helped out on the Firewall installation. And I guess I got my personal involvement in internet freedom. I don't know, it's hard to say. I feel like, as someone who studied technology, I got a computer science degree in undergrad, and I was also taking a lot of like philosophy and other liberal arts type courses. And I think I just internalized that this is sort of a key moment for the development of things like the internet, and that it was a responsibility that I had as a person fluent in that to help like guide it in the right direction as I was seeing it. So I guess from an early stage, like out of college, I kind of I got interested in becoming more political, becoming more overtly activist in how I was approaching technology. I can talk more about the Firewall stuff later, but that's how I got started.
Hi, I'm Jason, and it's always a fascinating question whenever I meet folks who are interested and active in this space, like, how did you get started? And I think that's a great question. So I guess my story is for someone who actually does a lot of coding and research into technology issues today. You might be surprised to know I was actually an English major, and I worked as a book editor for 4 years in New York. And so I didn't write a single line of code for those 4 years, obviously. But I did start to get really interested in how media and governments and regulators interact with each other, and how those two intertwine. And so I actually decided to go to grad school to study and specifically media in China, because I worked on a book about CCTV, which was the state Chinese television network in China. And it got me really fascinated in thinking about how does a country foster and produce an environment where they can promote a single entity like CCTV. And so I was thinking I would go to grad school to study how books are regulated in China. But obviously, once I started grad school, this is around the time that social media is really going crazy in China. And so obviously I switched my focus away from this particular traditional media towards a newer style media, and I got interested in analyzing how it was regulated and also how technically what was viewable via these networks. And so I dug into it and started coding, and that's how I got involved in censorship monitoring, censorship tracking.
What I can say is sort of my personal path, right, is like I went to journalism school. I also studied philosophy, in fact. But I originally sort of started out with sort of how to use technology to do storytelling, not necessarily how to use technology to find stories. So a lot of my work is in sort of front-end design, development, data visualization, and I worked at the Washington Post for a bit doing graphics there, interactive graphics, and doing sort of like political coverage, things like that. And then my shift to ProPublica was really sort of a pursuit of trying to use technology to do all aspects of journalism, which we're really focused on there. And I think our projects are really self-driven, so I sort of have the freedom to do 50% of the time like projects the organization wants me to do, and then the other half of the time sort of what am I interested in. And we had a chance sort of collaborate 2 years ago to really dive into sort of censorship in China, and ProPublica doesn't traditionally cover international news or international issues that often, but sort of like through our newsroom support, sort of I was able to be like, okay, like I think this is a really interesting story. We should really look into it and see what we can do that's different than what traditional news would cover. And yeah, so that's how that came to be.
And I'll answer my own question too. Since I'm an artist, I traditionally make installation-based video projection, but I spent a summer in China in 2011 where I worked with a curator named James Elaine. And sorry if some of you guys have heard this story, but we brought over 12 American artists to Beijing to live in 798 and meet a bunch of Chinese artists, do studio visits, tour galleries and museums. And one of the things that was really interesting for me to experience and for them to also take part in is in using a VPN to access sites like Facebook and Gmail, what kind of patterns did we see that would occur after you've logged on for, say, 10 minutes? And let's say you're just looking up local stores versus another person who logged in for 10 minutes and was looking up local church service times. How their connection might break or be interrupted, or how long it would last before it started to be really slow. And so I began to be curious about issues of accessibility online at that time. And then this is a slightly different story, but one of the artists that we met in China that summer was a young gentleman that was 24, and he was homosexual, and he was an art student. And he had this really deep, wild fascination with American culture. And his dream in life was to go to America. And so we talked a lot about pop culture and kind of his ideas of America and how he wanted to go. And then the following summer, we were supposed to take a trip there again and do the residency again, and it didn't work out. And for a number of reasons, including some family issues and a lot of kind of emotional issues that he was having around his identity at the time, he ended up taking his own life. And that for me was a very real moment where somebody I knew that was close and dear to me had their kind of hopes and dreams very wrapped up in this worldview perception that was largely experienced through the internet. And so I started to think, too, about how cultural perspectives are formed, how the internet really mediates our understanding of what is true. And that kind of was the personal spark for me that happened many years before this project came to be, but was kind of, that's my inspiration. So, yeah. So thanks for sharing all of your beginning stories. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about the projects now. So Cece, since you kind of already delved a bit into your work, can you tell us more about your experience with how foreign websites get blocked in China and your work surrounding that?
So the main project that we did on sort of the Chinese firewall was something we published in 2014. And sort of I talked a little bit earlier about how we wanted to do multiple sites, and we sort of had set up all of these different systems to test, and we were trying to verify which ones were coming back accurately until we ran into these sort of security issues if we wanted to go further. And so in the end, I talked to sort of the folks behind Great Fire to ask for permission to sort of, can I use your data as the main sort of backbone of like what we're trying to figure out, which is, for those of you who are not familiar, Great Fire allows you to look up any site using their website, and they will sort of test in multiple places in China whether or not it's accessible at that moment, right? And those sort of servers exist somewhere in China, and the identities sort of the people behind it are kept secret, so that sort of the repercussions cannot be however severe they might be. And using this service, basically what we did is we selected a list, I think initially somewhere around 12 sites, and then we increased it to 18 that we would sort of test every single day. And so the tests only run automatically on Great Fire if it's like on the top 2,000 most popular websites of that day or something like that. And some of these sites, including like the New York Times, would make it, some wouldn't. And so we picked all news organizations that had an international presence, many of which had a Chinese-specific language version of their site. And we wanted to see, sort of based on past information, and then going into the future, once we start testing daily, what sort of patterns we would see. And I went back today just to like look at some patterns over time. And the things that you can really start to see, right? Like we had some hypotheses about how it would work. And obviously we read a lot of academic work around this topic. But what we really got to see just through the data visualization itself is that once a site is blocked, right, it will just stay blocked. It's not like a daily fluctuation situation where like today someone has decided that Huffington Post should be down and tomorrow it's going to come back up. It's usually long stretches of time. And usually the initiation of a site being blocked comes along with some sort of coverage event that happened. And so something that we saw in the first year in 2014, right? So Occupy Central had happened in September of that year, and that's when the South China Morning Post, its normal version as well as its Chinese language version, got blocked. And what's interesting is that they have been blocked for like a year and a half or something like that. And then in 2015, in July, sort of that streak ended. So like every day they were blocked, and then suddenly they were like, okay again. And like nothing has really happened since. Versus the Wall Street Journal on the 25th anniversary of Tiananmen in 2014, they got blocked right away. Wall Street Journal Asia has been blocked for a long time, but their main sort of English version and then their specific Chinese language version were blocked, and they're still blocked today. And there's no blip in the middle in which they were available. And then there are also like some random like activity that we found specifically around the Huffington Post, where it's always like unclear whether or not the Huffington Post is accessible. And the way I define that is like, so Great Fire tries to test the site itself on as many servers as they can. And sometimes the number of servers they test on fluctuates. And so, through sort of consulting with them a little bit too, we do a little bit of our own math, just, easy percentage stuff. That's like what percentage of the servers came back like actual negative and then just like unknown. And so we created these like likely blocked, likely not blocked categories in addition to what the site normally has. And with HuffPo, they're always like in the middle. Like half the servers always come back unclear. And so we give them this like yellow status. And it seems like, to me, hard to imagine that actually someone is like paying a ton of attention to the Huffington Post specifically and constantly changing the settings. But I wonder if overall their site has some sort of like not entirely censored, but like medium status. But yeah, so that's basically sort of like what we found. And if you're interested, you can sort of still go, and it updates every day. We check sort of once per day whether or not 18 sites are being blocked, and it's very consistent behavior is basically what you'll be able to see.
And so when you have done this research and data, how do you, I know because you're a designer as well, so how do you represent this visually in a creative way that engages you? Like, how do you do that?
Yeah, so data visualization is like the art of like making raw data something that is easy for people to consume right away, and then also sort of interesting for them to consume, and sort of a issue we have in news all the time. And with this sort of, Great Fire actually has this great presentation after you do a search where they tell you, based on anyone else who has ever made a search, here are the dates on a calendar in which it was blocked and which it wasn't. So something we wanted to do, right, is like, well, I would really love to know what was the content of those news sites, right, of the home pages when this was happening. And so there is a colleague of mine, I guess in journalism overall, who works at the LA Times. And as a side project, he built something called Past Pages, which is meant to be a news archive service. And so he goes through and sort of takes the screenshot of the homepage of many news sites every 10 minutes of the day. And so we sort of merged these two projects together, right? Great Fire and Past Pages, so that on our site, what happens is if you pick any page or if you go to the calendar view, you can see sort of the overall pattern. So all the pages are overlaid with like a red, green, orange type of scale to tell you right away, was it censored or not, or was it available or not? And then if you want to, you can click in and actually see what the page looked like on that day. And you can sort of go through for an entire year's worth of pages. And that was like sort of very interesting to people because there's sort of the long calendar version, but then there's like the little mini map where you can see a whole year at once if you want to. And we sort of saw a lot of sort of engagement with that, and we got a lot of emails after we came out with people suggesting additional sites that they wanted us to monitor. So that was pretty cool.
Okay. Jason, so I'm going to follow up with you here. Can you tell us, so we heard from CC about foreign websites being blocked in China. Will you tell us a little bit about how domestic censorship takes place in China?
Yeah, I think that's a great distinction to make so in essence, in China, there's multiple levels of censorship that can take place. So the one that most folks here in the US are familiar with is the so-called Great Firewall, which is the namesake of Firewall Cafe. So this is essentially when users are inside China and when they try and retrieve foreign websites, so for instance, the New York Times, which is based in the US, it passes through this technical system which filters out certain websites so you can't access them. However, that's just one aspect of the censorship. There are other ways that information gets censored online in China as well, which I'm going to show you a little bit about, including on domestic websites. So these are websites in China that are produced by Chinese companies, but because of the way that the companies are set up legally and they're bound by law to essentially self-censor their websites. And there are some elements of them receiving orders from the government to take down certain things, but for the most part, a lot of these companies go out of their way to ensure that no sensitive content is on their sites because they've seen examples of other companies that have been shut down because they weren't proactive enough in deleting content. I think one other point I want to make is that the research that I do is to track censorship and certainly to identify and provide a level of transparency, but also not only to identify certain things that are censored, but also to provide context and try and give understanding for what are the reasons for why things are censored. And I think understanding why companies have to censor things is really important for understanding what's happening. And so, it's not meant to be a project. The projects that I do aren't meant to be things that are purely meant to shame companies or purely meant to criticize the Chinese government, but to provide context for why things are censored and understanding what the reasoning is and what the reasoning of the rationale of government officials are. So let me just type this in. So I have a few slides. If you'll bear with me, I'll just show you a bit. So essentially, you might have noticed when you were searching at Firewall Cafe, this message would pop up occasionally if you were searching for sensitive items, which essentially means, according to relevant laws and regulations, you can't show you the search results. You see this on numerous websites, including Baidu. This one is coming from Weibo, which is one of the first websites that I analyzed and trying to understand what was blocked on that site. So Weibo is a social media site that's similar to Twitter. And so here's a very concrete example of how users get around censorship. So, for instance, when you actually search for, say, June 4, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is the dates when, or the dates that major protests came to a head in Tiananmen Square in Beijing in 1989, and where tanks were actually sent into the square to crush the student protesters. And so this is, I guess, an example of creative hacktivism, which we could talk about later. Essentially, because certain words are blocked on websites in China, users have found creative ways to get around them. So I don't know how many people are familiar with reading Chinese, but here's the English translation of what this 5月35 is, May 35th. So anyone Can anyone figure out why this would be an alternative way of getting around a search for June 4? Because May has 31 days, so May 32 is June 1. So May 35th is a clever way of trying to talk about a censored topic without actually using the word of the censored topic. But obviously, because this has gotten so popular, now May 35th in many websites and under many circumstances is now in turn blocked. And so you have to find other alternative ways of talking about June 4, which include using 8964, which you can understand, VIV, so the Roman characters, 6 quatre, which I assume is French. And this last one is the most fascinating for me. It's 2 to the 6th power, which is, if you convert that for the non-math whizzes out there, it turns out to be 64, which is a reference. So this is an example of the way that users work around the system, but essentially the government still is able to maintain a certain stranglehold over information. But it is interesting that users who are proactive enough are able to work within the system to share information about what it is they want to talk about. So I know I've been talking for quite a bit. So, or actually, here's one more example, which I think is really fun. So any idea why this term is blocked on Weibo, or was for a while? I think it still is, actually. You could try it. But any ideas why? I'll just say the first character is pronounced Mao. So any ideas why that might be? So Mao is not just hair, but also a reference to Mao Zedong. So so this bacon, salted preserved meat, refers not just to meat that you eat, but a certain other kind of preserved meat, Mao's body, which is laid in state in Tiananmen Square. So that is a coded reference for Mao, and activists obviously have had a lot of fun with the fact that that term is blocked, and they use other coded ways of talking about that, including Mao's hairdo atop a piece of salted meat or preserved meat. Or there's actually this, we don't actually know if this is a coded reference, but it was in Southern Metropolitan Weekly where I believe it's a woman who's a Mao impersonator happens to be in front of all this preserved meat. So whether or not this is the news magazine subversively supporting this coded reference, or whether it's just a coincidence, it's interesting. But yeah, so that's the kind of work that I do, trying to uncover the certain keywords that are blocked, but trying to understand this next level. How can they be circumvented? And also, what are the reasons behind why the government might want to stop this word from circulating? Because the Maolaro, if you actually look up references to it, it was often used as a way to criticize the Chinese state, in essence, saying like, oh, Maolaro, meaning Mao's dead body, would never approve of our capitalist intentions going on in the state economy today. So it's a way to criticize the government, and thus in turn the government wanted to step in and prevent not only Mao's image from being desecrated in that manner, but also as a way to prevent dissension. So that's, again, understanding the motives behind what's happening, I think, is really important. So other work I've done is tracking how things get censored on Chinese encyclopedias like Baidu Baike and Hudong. And my most recent study has been tracking censorship in WeChat, which a lot of you folks might have heard about from your Chinese friends, which is this new, really hot, all-in-one chat application. It's sort of like Facebook Messenger rolled up with Uber, rolled up with Venmo, rolled up with just about everything. So this is the new space where a lot of Chinese, not just hip, cool, young folks are on, but also where my mom is on. Like for my mom, WeChat is the internet. And so it's not just used for chatting, but also used for this sort of blogging. And obviously, if you think about blogging and how you could reach mass audiences with it, you could understand why it's censored. So for instance, if you click on certain news articles that actually say this content has been reported and we can't show it to you. So this obviously, experiencing this makes me wonder, like, what are the actual types of content that are being censored? So I tracked, and this is where my coding comes in. I, spidered a whole bunch of different links to WeChat blogging articles, and in the end, I tracked 36,000 articles over the period of about 2 months. And not surprisingly, articles that had sensitive keywords in them were more likely to be blocked. There's evidence in there that there was like preemptive blocking, meaning like words that you would expect to be censored aren't actually present in this, corpus of censored articles. Like, for instance, you would expect there to be references to June 4, which is why it's curious that none of the articles mention June 4. So the deduction that you have to make is that, they must be blocking anyone from posting any article about June 4. That's why it was never captured amongst the censored articles that I was tracking. So these are the types of things that I do. And also, finally, I found a lot of articles that relate to rumors as being censored. And you could wonder why would they bother tracking, deleting rumors, but until you realize that there's this ongoing anti-rumor campaign, which we could talk about later. And finally, the last thing I want to point out is that this is an example of China moving away from the really proactive, experiential censorship that we've been experiencing, or that a lot of us who are using the Chinese internet oftentimes encounter. Sometimes you click on things and things don't pop up. This is an example of, I guess, the Chinese system. A lot of the Chinese systems are moving towards ways of censorship which are more frictionless, meaning you never see the censorship. This, you still sort of see it, but I think it's a move away from more blanket censorship in the past, and I think that's something worth discussing. But I think I'm a little over time, so I might as well pass.
I did have one question for you, Jason. So when the Chinese are coming up with these kind of creative workarounds, how does it catch on? Is there a specific demographic that you've noticed that starts these terms? Is it usually people who really follow politics, younger people? How do these things get started? Do you know?
So yeah, there's actually been great research done into this sort of what researchers call morphs, what is it? What's the term for a brand new word that's invented? Neologism. Thank you. So people have analyzed, in particular, BBS forums, like when a sensitive topic comes up, how quickly do people switch over to coded language? And oftentimes they actually switch over before the censorship even happens. There's a recognition that this is a sensitive topic. I'm going to have to use this sort of more playful language in order to evade the eventual censorship that will come. And so obviously it's people who are engaging in playful activity online, what you would expect, young folks. But we also do have to keep in mind that the folks who are really interested in evading censorship is a tiny, tiny percentage of the entire internet sphere in China. For the most part, from my general sense and from research, most folks in China are okay with the censorship that goes on. They don't see it as censorship in the way that you and I necessarily see it, as like an affront to First Amendment rights. They see it as like necessary security, moderation and protecting of citizens from immoral content and content that could lead to violence. And so, even though it is probably young people who are the most engaged out of the people who are engaging in this sort of creative hacktivism, it is probably mostly young people and people who have had experiences, where they've been inspired to be more independent from traditional values. Young people in China are also, on the whole, not to make a crass generalization, but also quite apathetic with regards to political issues on the whole, I think. And so we do have to think about, remind ourselves that the value system that a small slice of activists that we celebrate and cheer on don't necessarily reflect the entire society.
Thank you, Jason. All right. So we've looked at, we have a question, yes.
I actually have a cousin who works in the government censoring Weibo content to protect, but it's to protect people from scams. So the internet in China, especially on Weibo, it's like on 4chan, right? Anything goes. People post really random stuff, and there's all sorts of scams trying to trick old people into buying medicine that it's not good for them and it's super expensive. So he is actually one of these people safeguarding the mass from this destructive content. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is, I was curious what you learned about the whole Taylor Swift Tiananmen 1989 thing, if that's taken off or if anything has happened since then. And then the third thing is the whole China open Sesame Credit score stuff, if you have any insight.
with regards to the first question, yeah, I totally agree that there is necessary moderation and content filtering that needs to take place. Like for the for that WeChat project that I did, a lot of the articles that I found to be censored are actually the kind of things you do want to be censored. They're talking about inciting violence. They're talking about, you know, racist attitudes and celebrating all these sorts of things that you probably don't want to be shared amongst, you know, your populace if you're trying to create a good public sphere. But you do also have to think about like whose values are being imposed here. Like who decided that I shouldn't be allowed to be scammed? It's like, you know, maybe you want to be a part of a system that allows greater liberties with regards to what content exists. The Taylor Swift thing, if you guys aren't familiar, Taylor Swift released a fashion line in China. And, you know, if you don't know, Taylor Swift's newest album is called 1989. And so you could see why there's a potential weird, you know, awkwardness when her initials are TS and her birth date is 89. So, yeah, it's the year she was born. So, you know, TS, Tiananmen Square 89. So there was genuine censorship, I think. But it was, you know, it was made a big deal of here because she was actually trying to promote and sell the fashion line in China. I don't know if there's any, but you guys could follow up whether there's any repercussions or what follow up. As for the third point, what was the third point? It's Open Sesame. Okay, so this is a big thing that people have been talking about. So if you guys aren't familiar, this Sesame Credit is essentially in China. There's no national credit bureau the way there is here in the U.S., like how we have Experian and Transfax or whatever the three credit agencies who produce like your FICO score that you don't care about unless you buy a home. In China, they've been trying to think about how do we also instill in our banking system and our financial system a similar level of way of assessing someone's trust, because right now there are a whole bunch of, you know, the banks basically, they don't have this metric to assess whether or not you're a good they're the lender, so you're the whatever, the borrower. Yeah, thank you. So what they've been trying to do is develop this sort of national system, just like how we have. But obviously, they've been designing it with Chinese characteristics, which include infusing these metrics with not just your borrowing history, but potentially looking at other metrics like, and this is all in proposed form right now, this is just a plan, they might potentially look at, say, your past educational transgressions. They might look at your arrest records. They might look at your social media. So this is what gets a lot of people concerned, this potential that they could go to say, like every time you get a post censored, that might ding your credit score and you might not be able to buy a home. But again, this is all in proposed form. There have been variations that have actually been developed by different companies. Like I know, I think Tencent tried to develop something where you could get, expedited visas if you had a good score with them. But again, this is something that's still to be worked out. And I think, if you were to design a credit score from the scratch here in the US, you probably would want to infuse it with more metrics than we do have right now. But whether or not we want to track people's social media is a whole other thing.
Yeah, I mean, I might add one other thing about what I've been reading about Open Sesame is that I think your friend's score influences your score. So there's this weird social effect of having individuals kind of self-regulate each other rather it kind of spreads out the control. But another thing I wanted to point out is our social media is heavily reflective of certain values also, and Facebook has they employ lots of people to take down terrible things, and sometimes they take down things that look to the person going through all of the stream of terrible things, and they take things out that they shouldn't, and then there's controversy. And arguably Twitter could be doing more for especially women who are being harassed by mobs of men's rights activists. So there's this weird balance of what's safety and what's censorship. And I think it's very dependent on what your perspective is, if you happen to be an MRA or whatever.
Yeah, to that point, it is, I feel like censorship here is less frictionless though, because someone can also be like, oh, my nipples were on Instagram and this is what happened, we took it down. But in China, there's no chance for them to even, to have that discussion. So I would say that,
So I can talk a little bit about the Firewall Cafe software. I guess the first thing to say is just it's a little bit in progress still. It has been for a while. It's been a hard project. It's been a fun challenge though. But essentially, it's a few different things. But the main ingredients are there's a Chrome extension that allows two different windows to communicate to each other, and it kind of observes as you're searching on Google, and then like behind the scenes takes that query and like plugs it into some other software that's running. And that other software basically gives it back a translation. And that translation might be from Google's Translate API, so like a machine translation, or it could also come from some stuff that we've manually put in place. And then it sort of takes that result and plugs it into the other browser window. And that's what you see when you search on Google, and then like suddenly you have the results for a Chinese translation in Baidu. And I don't read Chinese, so like often it's hard to know if they're good translations or not. Sometimes I pick up on when they're not, though. Like an example was like the phrase activist, and all of the Baidu search results were coming back with like these guys in business suits, and they were like charging ahead, and so I took the Chinese one and I plugged it back into the machine translation, and it came back as action. So I was like, okay, well, clearly this is just like a breakdown in how Google's Translate treated this one phrase. And I think that's been a theme with the project in general. It's like hard to know where things break down sometimes. Like if a page doesn't load, it could be any number of things happening. It could be like literally the internet in the cafe is slow right now. Or it could be that one of the server things that I wrote, or one of the software components of the project broke, or it could be censorship, or it could be a different layer of censorship, or and then there's the question of like, if you don't get results back, how do you represent an absence visually? And I actually, I'm sad to say, I haven't really treated that well yet. Like, basically, if there's no image results, it doesn't get recorded into our growing library of queries. And I think that's something I wish I had time to do better at, but yeah, it's been kind of like a struggle just to like keep all of the stuff working the right way.
Yeah, how things keep breaking at or not always, but like when you occasionally encounter these things failing and you don't necessarily know exactly what's causing it, I think is a beautiful analogy for how you sometimes experience internet issues in China. Oftentimes, if you go to a foreign website, or maybe even a domestic one, sometimes things just don't load in the way that you expect them to. Some things are missing. Sometimes you get an error connection message. Sometimes it loads perfectly fine. And I think the way that the system is set up makes you question what is actually happening, and you don't know who to blame. You don't necessarily can't blame the government for this because you know it's censorship. It could be any number of issues. It could be your ISP is just really shoddy, or maybe it's your proxy that you've been running. Maybe they've been really slow. So I think it's a beautiful analogy to the distributed blame that goes on when you're in China using the internet.
I have an example that kind of touches on this too, which is I'm teaching a class remotely over Google Hangouts. It's an unusual arrangement, but the students are live in a classroom, and I'm kind of beamed in over Google Hangouts. And one of them was giving a presentation on this media artist, Darius Kazemi, whose website is tinysubversions.com. And he was trying to present on this artist, and they were like, the site's not working. It must be down. And it was working for me, and so I was like, well, that's strange, but it's possible that your campus network is blocking it because it has the word subversions in the URL. And so I did my due diligence, and I contacted the network administrator, and I explained my theory, and he was like, well, yes, actually, it was blocked. And it wasn't because of like some keyword match. It was because ultimately it was on a list that they get from a third-party vendor. And that list was, the reason his site was on the list was because I guess it got hacked a year ago or something, and now it's blocked in all these places, and that's the reason why they couldn't access it. But the campus network administrator has no recourse. Like, he's not going to stop using that vendor's list. So it's just basically going to continue to be blocked. And I guess, yeah, that uncertainty about not, like, it looked identical to when a site is offline. Like there was no message the way that Baidu like informs you that this site has been blocked. Like that would have been, I think, a more honest way of handling it for the network. Like if the campus network actually informed you that this was on a list and this is the list, complain to those guys.
That's interesting. We actually had 30 middle schoolers visit Firewall Cafe yesterday, and it was quite an experience. I asked the students, like, what is a firewall? And the first thing they related it to is the firewalls that they all have at their public school. Like, it was a very real, everyday experience for them that they can't get on YouTube at their middle school. So I want to be respectful of time. And I'm going to ask Dan one last question, but then I want to open up the floor to the audience so that you all can ask these people your burning questions. Dan, my last question for you was, since we are talking about creative hacktivism, I know that you're an artist that works in the realm of technology and web-based art a lot. So do you want to talk a little bit about any of your other projects as they relate to what we're discussing today?
So I've been doing some work with Wi-Fi darknets, and I have a particular project I've been doing for a while called Occupy Here, which is a Wi-Fi network that if you join it, doesn't get you on the internet. It just puts you in contact with people who are there in the same room with you. And this was something that I created at Zuccotti Park during Occupy Wall Street. I was reading about these things called fin-fisher devices that pretend to be a cell phone tower but are secretly like the police, like monitoring the traffic. So it was partially to evade that sort of not censorship, surveillance that was happening at the park, and it was partially just because the network service was bad. Like I couldn't actually use my 3G service at the park. So I've been continuing that project, and my latest iteration is I'm working with Joanne McNeil, who's a writer, to develop curricula for kids, like middle school age kids, to kind of present them with this undeveloped social media thing and be like, okay, this is yours. We're going to talk about what are the rules for this online thing that's not on the internet, that's not dangerous. You get to invent the rules. You also get to decide how to enforce the rules. One of you will be the administrator, and you have to like go through and find the violations that you invented and censor them, I guess. Basically we're teaching a certain kind of self-censorship. But it's been really interesting, and I think they all want to be the administrator. That's the thing. It's like everyone always does.
All right, so I think that's a really fun note to end on. I wanted to ask if the audience had any questions about any of the research. Okay.
So I was wondering, like, so the Chinese firewall, or golden shield as they call it in China, is limited by capacity. So in order to block more sites, they actually have to unblock others unless they upgraded their capacity in the last few months. But just recently this week, Xi Jinping said on March 10th, no foreign company can provide any content in China, which is sound, audio, animation, games, and text, and websites without government approval through a licensed partner. So to do this, they basically essentially block all non-approved foreign content. So in terms of like the firewall of China, do you think it got upgraded, or do you think it's more powerful? Because even now, China really has a hard time blocking open web. It can block all the other types of VPN, but open web has been pretty challenging for the Chinese firewall. So any comments on that?
Yeah, I'll leave it to other folks to talk about the tech specs of the Great Firewall. But as far yeah, blocking particular websites, it happens on an arbitrary basis, it seems, sometimes. So things get unblocked and things get blocked, at different times depending on different circumstances. So it wouldn't be surprising if, things get unblocked. But I don't really know exactly that. I didn't realize that there was a max cap of how much blocking that they could do, but it certainly makes sense from what you're saying. As for foreign companies operating in China, it's been that way for a long time about how foreign companies have always had to have like a local partner in order to even have have their local content hosted in China. So like, for instance, if you go to like, TechCrunch's Chinese version language website, if you go to the bottom, it actually has an ICP license. Like, they've partnered with a local Chinese company in order to have their site locally hosted in China. So that way they don't have to deal with the Great Firewall. They don't have to deal with people trying to access the Chinese version of TechCrunch and get really slow speeds because it goes through the Great Firewall that's actually located in China. So it's not necessarily a big change. I think it will impact, companies who weren't prepared for this, and so they might potentially have outages. But if you're a serious player in China, you've already thought about this and you've already had local partners and stuff like that. But yeah, I'm sure it impacts a lot of companies greatly, and we'll see what the outcome is.
It's also very labor intensive. I mean, they have a huge manpower issue. They need people to actually monitor and watch things. So they don't have like unlimited scaling. There's a certain capacity in which even the people who work there are human beings who are kind of overworked. If you want to sort of transmit data, you just transmit it to a picture. Someone has to physically look through all those pictures to make sure there's no encrypted data or words that's being transmitted. So I mean, like for example, you're looking at things normally on websites, but most of the protests digitally in China occurs in sort of other platforms, like the games industry. Like the biggest protest by the young people of China came into a World of Warcraft movie to machinima. That's basically when there was a transition from the 9 to NetEase, and the World of Warcraft was blocked in China for like 5 or 6 months. So the people actually protested through a machinima, and the censors didn't know about it for like 5 or 6 months because 54 minutes of that 60-minute video was a very boring movie. But the last 6 minutes, they just started complaining about China, the Olympics, the poison, the censorship, and that basically went through the censors for 6 months. So that's what people are doing to evade the censors. They're not looking for the normal means of communication. They're not only coding, they're coding the medium in which they're transmitting the information.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question, and just a bit about my background. I spent almost 4 years living in Nanjing. I was working there, and I did a lot of organizing there for charity projects, and I actually helped to launch a social enterprise that's still running, and it's running a lot around a WeChat group, or like a lot of different groups that I use WeChat to create. I also helped to launch a WeChat group for NYU alumni in Shanghai that has over 300 people in it now. So I found it to be really interesting, just different ideas around the capability of WeChat groups for organizing social activism type of things. Like, if anyone wants to comment on, is this something that folks in China are concerned about? Like, is there additional monitoring going on around what type of groups are forming in WeChat? And like, where's that going?
So yeah, I did quite a bit of research into WeChat, and I'm really fascinated by how, for many people, it is their primary form of communication. And so obviously, the fact that you use it for just about everything makes it, surveillance that much bigger of an issue. If you're doing your banking on there, you're doing like your grocery shopping on there, you're ordering your plane tickets on there, it's really scary if you start doing sensitive actions on there. It can be tied to everything that you do. But as for the groups, it's really interesting to me that when we did research into what's being censored on WeChat, we actually noticed that the one-to-one chat and small group chats aren't censored at all. You can type just about any, you literally can type anything to each other and you'll receive it on both ends. And so what our conclusion was, to an extent, was that censorship really matters when you're trying to broadcast to lots of people. When you're talking to smaller groups, even if it's 200 people, the authorities, at least up until the near recently, WeChat has, I guess, had worked out an agreement, or they've decided that it's not worth necessarily the effort and expansion of resources to target and focus these small groups. There might be surveillance going on, but censorship isn't occurring, which is really interesting. The censorship is only occurring on these blogging platforms where you're actually reaching out to potentially millions of people, which is sort of a reaffirmation of this theory that Gary King, a researcher at Harvard, has put forth, that that the censors are really focusing only on things that inspire collective action, and they don't really care about general criticism of the party, or you talking with your friend about how like your local danwei whatever is really annoying, and you can't get a particular benefit. So that I have some issues with that, like making that blanket statement. But I think for the most part, if you have limited resources, you focus on the stuff that really matters. You focus on protests. You focus on things that might cause total social upheaval, and you may not care as much about like your small group of 100 folks chatting about a small environmental issue. Obviously, that shifts depending on whether or not that grows into something bigger. But I think that's the general consensus.
Yeah, and I mean, just as a follow-up on that, I was in China last April, right after the Nepal earthquake happened, and via a number of different groups, I actually saw multi-city organizing efforts spring up where people were connecting with each other and literally coordinating logistics for how to help Nepal, and they were doing all of this from mainland China. So I mean, it's one view to say like a group of 200 or 400 people on WeChat doesn't seem to be that big of a threat, or but there's a lot of interesting like when groups start to interconnect and like people in one group will share a QR code for like join this other group, share this with your friends in another city, and then I think it really can become a network for action actually. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens.
We'll take one more question for the sake of time. We'll take one more question.
I was just wondering, like, how quickly the censors catch up to the more like grassroots level linguistic innovation in terms of like writing about certain sensitive topics. So like another thing is that the Chinese language is extremely heavy in homonyms. So a lot of people will just use other homonyms. So like, are there algorithms that the censors have developed that kind of auto-block other homonym combinations that are basically nonsense unless you know what they're actually referring to, or like is there like an average amount of time delay between, because like if you can do research in the US on how people are getting around the censors, then those censors are probably doing the same kind of research themselves and being pretty proactive about it.
So one of the past projects that we did was looking specifically at content that had been taken down on Weibo, right? And so as Jason said earlier, specifically it isn't literally the government or government employees, but actually people at the company who are being hired by the company to review content. And the way that that script worked is that we checked sort of basically like 100 people who were a mix of folks who had like at least a certain threshold of followers, right? So they had a certain amount of megaphone, and we would check every 6 minutes for new content that they had posted, and then we would check both in those 6 minutes, but also concurrently every 10 minutes whether or not that content was still there, right? So we sort of like maintained that sort of system, and at least for us, when we were checking like what percentage of content is gone, and then parsing it in between like self-deletion versus like a different type of error message that is usually associated with censorship. It happened, there were posts that were taken down within those 6 minutes, but then there were posts that were taken down like days after as well. And for us, the specific focus was not actually text, but imagery. So a lot of us it was sort of like, what posts did these people publish that had images? And if it had accompanying text, that was fine. But sort of those imagery sort of analysis was what we were trying to look for, because it's harder, right, to detect whether or not it's something you could automatically filter out. And yeah, so it can be really fast. There was a article in Reuters that came out a few years ago, but then also the artist Ai Weiwei like interviewed someone who sort of worked as a censor about sort of like what it's like. And part of it is sort of there's like, it's been brought up before, sort of like the overworked theme. But what we know so far, I think in the like published sphere, is that there are sort of just like shifts, right? It's like constant shifts of people, and your job is to essentially like, in addition to the automatic technology that catches phrases really easily, to come up with sort of like what is going on right now using your human brain to figure out like, are there additional phrases that we should be catching, or are there just one-off posts that we should be catching as well? So there's sort of a mix of manual review and automation, and sort of different tiers of automation as well. Yeah.
Well, you guys have been a very awesome audience. I think one of my hopes my main hope actually for Firewall Internet Cafe was really to stir up conversation. So that's part of part of the design of inviting the public in of all age groups, old, young, American, Chinese, it doesn't matter. And then also to host these events. So your conversing with us is exactly what I'm hoping to provoke and the art of this project. So thank you. And thank you to all the panelists for participating today. I know some of you all are probably a little hungry, so there's some like cheese and crackers in the back. You're welcome to stay and ask the panelists any questions. And thank you so much for attending. Have a good night.